Okay, so we are back for our third Revelations episode. This one, we're going to be talking about funny characters in TTRPGs.
Or player attempts at funny characters.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's plenty to talk about, both for like the effect you have successful and unsuccessful.
No, we have a long list here, but I want to start right off the bat by pointing out that funny is definitely subjective.
Absolutely, yeah. So I want to start with why I wanted to bring this topic up. This was on my sort of initial list of things I wanted to talk about, and there's some kind of specific reasons for it. So listeners of the podcast will know that all of us tend to enjoy like having funny characters or being funny while we play the game, and I don't think that we're terribly uncommon in that sense. However, I think that there are some like good and bad, or I guess more and less successful ways to try to like be funny when playing these games, and funny characters in themselves is kind of one avenue you can take to do it. And I was really inspired because I play in an in-person group where I live that, is never on the podcast. And sometimes I run games, most of the time I'm playing in them. One of the times recently, like within the last couple months that I ran one of these games, one of my players, who is normally the DM, his character was sort of like so absurdly, inherently comedic that it made me kind of start thinking about this topic quite a bit. The character, I forget the actual character's name, but he was some sort of like ranger class where I think it's like a beastmaster is the subclass or something like that. But his weapon was his animal, and it was a big bass called, I believe its name was Sir Finley Bassington. So it was just like such a like, I don't know, a necessarily comedic character based on the way that he had designed it, that it was sort of interesting to me and made me think about sort of the nature of those characters and like the degree to which that kind of stuff may or may not be appropriate for a game that you're playing. So that was kind of my inspiration for this and made me want to talk about it. But what are some things that you want to hit in this? And I'll kind of list mine as well when you're done.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a short topic list, but I'll also throw a couple of sensibilities out here that I'd like to, I guess, work into the conversation.
Yeah.
One is that I'm going to, I think, risk coming off as anti-comedy, and I want to make it clear that I'm not anti-comedy.
Yeah. Good point to bring up.
But I guess in a nutshell, where I am is I like comedy, but I don't love comedies.
Sure, right. You like things being funny, but not like... You don't want that to be like the primary thing that's going on.
I don't want that to be the genre of the game.
Right.
But humor absolutely has its place and can really make things better. So with that out of the way, some topics. You had listed a few, and I'll let you talk about those. The ones that I tacked on were comedy at the table that's in character versus out of character, which are very different. Mm-hmm. How real people in real life use comedy, like in their interpersonal interactions, and where I'm going with that is, people in really bleak situations notoriously crack jokes. Mm-hmm. This is part of the way that we deal with upsetting things.
Yeah, gallows humor, dark humor. Yeah.
Yes. And yeah, so taking it into like how the appropriateness or the effectiveness of black or dark humor. So those were the ones I wanted to add on, but you came in with a pretty long list.
Yeah, well, and I think we should start with mine just because mine are a little more basic, and then yours are
completely agree.
A little, like mine are 100 level, yours are probably more like 300 level.
Sure.
So the topics I wanted to hit were like, what makes a character funny typically? If you're trying to make a funny character, and then why would you want to make a funny character? Like, what are the benefits of that? What are the downsides of having funny characters or humor in general? And then I had one that was having a quirk versus being a clown, which is getting a little more specific about designing a funny character. But I think the easiest place to start is, what makes a character funny? And I think, we can talk in generalities, and then I think we should also kind of address some of the funny characters that have popped up in our podcast as well, just to cite some examples. So I wrote down a couple things on a list that you don't have, just some very basic things that tend to get reactions out of people. Funny voices, obviously, tend to, one, they set a tone of, hey, I'm trying to be funny and silly, and they prime people to be ready for something comedic.
Well, and few jokes land as consistently as when you're a DM, if you make this elaborate setup for an NPC, and there's someone, very grand or imposing or something like that, and then you keep building, and then give them some ridiculous voice.
Yes. Yeah. like they're this big knight, and then they sound like a little kitty cat, like, oh, hello, when they start talking.
That's never not funny.
Right. I think a good example of that, I'll link this. There was there's a YouTube channel called Corridor Digital, and I think it was them. They did a D&D game that they posted on YouTube a long time ago, where it was basically like a bunch of high school kids throwing a party. And
I've seen that. Yeah, it's really funny.
I showed it to you. Yeah, and these girls show up at the door that they've invited in, and they've all got these cutesy voices, and then the last one comes in, it sounds like an ogre. and it totally throws all the players off because it's just not what they expected. Yeah. Perfect example. Like I said, I'll link that so people can check it out. It's a funny video. Yes, so that's sort of a standard setting expectations and then subverting them, which at the end of the day is kind of the root of a lot of humor. And that kind of setup and payoff is really, really, I don't know, emblematic of like simple table humor that tends to go a long way. What are some examples of that in our
actually, hold on, campaigns? Can I redirect this?
Yeah, please.
We should talk about this, but I'd kind of like to take a step back and talk about when humor is or isn't appropriate in games, or like levels of funniness in different types of games before we start talking about things Specifics. That make them. You know what I mean?
Yep, I agree.
So like if you are a player, let's say you're the dungeon master, right? I work with you or something like that. You run a game, and you invite me to play D&D with you and your group. Mm-hmm. I've played D&D before. Like, what should I be thinking when I'm going to make a character in terms of seriousness or funniness? Like, is that a question I should be asking you? Is that something you should be telling me in advance? Let's kind of play that out.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of that will come from your experience at that table. So, like, that's if you can lean on that, that's the first thing to lean on, I think.
Sure.
Like, if you've been playing at that table, and then we're doing a one-shot, and so you're making a new character, and you can kind of do anything. If you've been playing at that table for a while, then you probably have a good idea of kind of what the baseline is and what the left and right limits are of, like, what's acceptable and what isn't for building a character. And so that's the first place you should look. Often, if you're in a new group, or you've got new people in the group, or you're playing a different game or something like that, or it's the same group in the same game, but the DM is going for something else, then those things can shift. And so I think that it's probably a good question to ask beforehand. One easy thing to do is, instead of asserting, hey, I'm playing X character, like, message or call your DM or whatever, and ask them, hey, I'm thinking of doing X. Does that fit with what you're doing? Like, phrase it as a question that the DM can get some input on, instead of asserting what your character is going to be and then putting them in the position where they either have to accept a character that doesn't fit, or have to shut you down because you've already decided something as a player that doesn't fit with their game. So
I'm going to give an alternative to that. I agree with that, but I also think it's a good idea to, if you're a player coming to a new table, or to your point, even if you're not coming to a new table, you've played there before, but maybe you're playing a different game that night, come with a couple of different character ideas.
Yeah.
It's never a safe choice to show up only with your character, Dick McFartbutt, whose fingers are all penises and he only talks and farts. Like, that's not... that's a niche character that might be fine, but probably won't.
Yes.
And if you show up and say, I'm going to... This is my character, and whatever we're playing, that's it. Right. And I'm thinking, like, actors in movies here. Like, if your character is Adam Sandler in every movie I've seen Adam Sandler in other than
Uncut Gems.
Other than Uncut Gems.
Yeah.
And there are only so many movies you can cast that guy in. He can't be in Saving Private Ryan. He can't be in like that's not, it doesn't make sense to approach it that way.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that is an excellent point. And another kind of way to approach that, and this is more on the DM side, I read it in a book that I'm currently reading called Proactive Role-Playing, which has a lot of really interesting ideas in it. But if you've got the time, and this especially works with experienced groups, don't even make characters until you get to the table. Yeah. Again, this is very much assisted by experience, as well as digital tools help with that a lot.
And if you're using shared flexibility in terms of time. A lot of times, especially as adults, like it's really nice to have people that are experienced enough that they can make their own characters in their own time and just show up ready to go. But I always prefer to do it together if possible. Yes.
And almost everything in that book that I just mentioned, Proactive Role-Playing, which I will link, almost all the advice is sort of contingent on the idea that you're doing a campaign. And so it's, if you spend the whole first session just making characters, that's fine. Obviously, you can't do a one-shot doing that because you just spent the whole session doing nothing.
Although maybe that's a concept for my next campaign. My next thing is I say, like, we're basically just going to do a series of one-shots, and we do character generation at the table. And every episode is just us making characters and, like, planning on what we're going to do with them. And then I go, and we're out of time. And then we just...
Right. And everyone ends with you, like, giving the plot hook and then, like, looking at your watch dramatically and being like, we'll have to pick this up next time.
Yep.
Yeah, well, but the point of that exercise in the book is directly related to this. It's that it can help everyone. It helps in a number of ways. For example, making sure that your characters' alignments are compatible, if you're doing an alignment system, that their goals are compatible. And then you can also use it as a tool to, have some sort of tone convergence, right? Because if you've got Dick McFartbutt and then I've got, Sirius McDower, like, those two people don't belong in the same party. Right. So,
or unless they're specifically supposed to be like a straight man.
Yeah.
Yes.
But generally speaking, right, if I'm trying to play serious, it's kind of like what you were saying back in one of the other revelations where, like, sort of everyone has to be on somewhat of the same page when it comes to certain aspects of tone. If one person is, the don't go in there guy with a slide whistle, you can't do something scary with that person at the table.
And I'll add to that, which is, well, two things. First, I think comedy is a particularly powerful, I don't want to call it a contaminant, but I'll call it an ingredient. Like, it's an overpowering one. And so a little bit goes a long way. Like, it's best used sparingly in a lot of cases. And the other thing I want to throw out, or I guess what I'm saying there is it's... no, I guess I already said it. I don't know why I just trailed off like
tactical that. Deployment is probably wise.
Yes. And the other note is the mismatch of the tonal mismatch is, I think, something that we've talked about before, but it's not just, hey, I want to be silly and you want to be serious. It's also, I want to play a really straight edge paladin and you want to play a rogue. Those also, unless we agree that, hey, this is kind of an interesting plot point for our party, and we as characters understand that there's tension there, we as players understand that, and the characters are going to act that out, but it's not going to be corrosive. it's very, very common for people to have these diametrically opposed character concepts. They don't work it out between them. And then the group as the party can't make decisions because they have written characters that could not agree on anything.
Right, they're incompatible and unsuited to being in a party together.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, and so yeah, that can manifest in a lot of different ways. And yeah, germane to this one, you know, and it's usually a little more on the player side, but yeah, if one person is trying to be super funny and then another person isn't, like, not that they've got a straight man character, but they are just trying to have a more serious game, then it's a lot easier for the comedy guy in this case to have fun than it is for the serious guy. And neither of those two things are wrong, but they are incompatible.
I think it's a lot easier for the comedy guy to steamroll than the not comedy guy. It's just that's kind of where I was going with, like, I guess the power of that ingredient.
Yes, it's easier to kill tension than to kill comedy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are no tension one-liners.
Yeah, because especially amidst comedy, they just sound really stupid, really, if you know, it's a tonal mismatch.
Yeah.
So if I think we've covered a good amount there, I think some character considerations then might be worth transitioning into here. So one of the notes I put in Discord was something to the effect of, like, character choices that are constraining versus flexible. So I'm gonna, you know, reference the character I already did earlier that my friend was playing, where you know, he's a dude with a bass for a weapon, and he has to, you know, he's constantly making reference to, like, the fish that he's swinging around, and the fish is, like, sentient and all these kind of crazy things like that. That is constraining in a sense. You're putting a pretty low ceiling on how serious things can be.
Well, I would argue, though, that it's not just that. You know, on the spectrum from I have a character that makes the odd pun to I have a character that has like a universe-changing level of comedy going on.
Right, reality bending.
Yeah, you know what I mean? That's exceptionally limiting.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to mention, I did talk to him about this, and we were on the same page that was fine for the one shot. It didn't really matter, but he was like, yeah, I would never do something like that during a campaign because that's ridiculous. So I do want to put it out there that I'm not just, you know, I'm not saying anything
I'm dragging
to you
this
all.
Guy.
Yeah, I'm finding him. I'm not saying anything on this podcast that he and I hadn't already discussed. But yeah. And then I'll reference Nerf's character from Curse of Strahd as well, where he's a goblin, which being a goblin in and of itself is fine. But he with a chicken on his head, which we never got far enough, I guess, to discover whether that had some sort of dramatic element to it. But similarly, you know, that's not quite as reality breaking. You could conceivably, like, see that, but again,
it's an obvious distraction.
It is. And so sort of my rule of thumb that I came up with is, if there's something about your character that the rest of the table has to ignore in order to, like, act normally, then you might have something that's a little too silly.
Yeah, I guess, and I don't want to, like, try to develop a vocabulary for this, but I'm thinking of it as, like, inherent comedy. Like, my character, just the sheet itself is funny.
Yeah.
Like,
my character is funny versus my character is a joke.
This is going to be pretty one note.
Yeah. Yeah. And so where I'm going with this is that I think that there's a better or a potentially more effective way to develop a character that has the potential to be funny. Is to give them something that's a little more flexible than the character themselves being a joke. So I think that there was a character that I played recently that I thought it has a really good example of this. Again, same group. I was a player during this one. This character that I was playing was very, like, easily convinced of things, and had fluid allegiance. So the setup for this one shot we were doing, in short, was that we got pressed into service into a foreign army after being captured by them. And so my character was immediately, like, thinking, okay, yeah, I'm definitely joining up, and how do I get ahead here? Like, his whole thing was he was willing to like sell out any moral ethic, whatever principle that he might have in order to like secure his position a little bit. And when he discovered that he wasn't going to be number one in their little squad, he like glued himself to number one so that he could be number two. That's something that in a comedic session, which this one was kind of comedic, that could be really funny. But that can also be something that works really well in a dramatic context as well. Right? That can create a lot of tension. It can make him untrustworthy. That's an interesting character feature that has the capacity to be either dramatic or comedic, depending on the circumstance. And so having a trait for your character that can be used in several directions, I think is a lot more effective than, having the character be a joke in some way of like, oh yeah, he, like you were saying earlier, all his fingers are penises or something like that, where that's constraining. Whereas something that's a little more flexible gives you like a lot of options.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No. I mean, I think we're in agreement here, and that's about what I have to say about it. I was thinking though, I want to describe a player that I've had before.
Yeah, please.
That I think this is a common thing that we see. I have a player that is very, very joke focused, and it's crystal clear to me that if it's not actively his turn, if I'm not asking him what he's doing, he is listening and trying to come up with his next joke. Like, if he's not talking, it's because he is attempting to formulate another joke. And he's a great player to have at the table. He's a good friend. But I know that there's really no chance of doing anything very serious if he's going to play with us.
You don't need to talk about me like I'm not here.
Well, but I wanted to make the point, though, because that got me thinking about... I think there's a hard truth that we all have to accept at some point, that some configurations of your friend group, or you can have friends that you really like to play with, and they don't play well together, or
right. Yeah.
They won't play a particular game you want to play well together just because of their own tastes and sensibilities and the way that they interact. And I've long been an advocate of, worrying less about the system and worrying more about the people you're playing with.
Right. Yeah.
But another thing I wanted to add for this particular talk is I know some people, and I have been guilty of this in the past, that if you actually think back to the conversations you've had with them, they're always joking.
Yes. Yeah, right. Where I've had this problem at work with one of my buddies where, like, not that he's like this all the time, but very frequently he'll be in this mood where you absolutely cannot get a serious word out of him. And so, like, in the event that you need to discuss something serious, whether it's work or, you just want to talk about something that's going on and get, like, a real opinion, you just can't. And it's like, well, like,
right. Everything's
I might
sarcastic,
as well just go away. Yeah.
Everything's an exaggeration, or it's ironic, or it's not always. I mean, you may not notice it, and you may not notice it that you're doing it. But it's kind of like the game that you introduced me to that we play every once in a while. The have you noticed that I've only been asking questions?
Yeah, right. Questions only. Yeah.
Right. Where like it's like that was 20 questions in a row, and I didn't catch on to that.
Yeah.
I definitely think this is a common thing where I suspect, but don't know that it's more common with dudes. But I guess where I'm going with this is, if you're trying to run a particular type of game, last time we talked about mysteries, and I talked a little bit about horror as well. Right.
And the two tend to go hand in hand in some sense.
There's quite a bit of overlap there, but we talked about tonal mismatches, and I talked about playing with people who could appreciate that kind of stuff. With the comedy stuff, it's the same thing, but more so here like comedy is something that you experience quite a bit of in your day-to-day life. Hopefully you don't experience that much horror.
One would hope, yeah.
A little bit of mystery is probably fine. But if you're trying to put together a game that you want to be somewhat serious, like you're trying to do a drama, before you invite someone, consider, like, have I ever had a serious conversation with this person?
Yeah. No, that is a great question that I've never thought to apply to this kind of situation. But yeah, that seems entirely appropriate.
Because it is, I mean, even if they're willing to try, it may be very unnatural to them.
Yes.
And some people, even in a dramatic setting, are really uncomfortable with tension.
Yes. Yeah.
And so their instinct, so it's similar to like, of course, no podcast listeners will know this because I'm only ever, it's you're not a good podcaster if you're really quiet while you're podcasting.
Yeah, sure.
I'm relatively quiet socially. And I know from experience that many people are made very uncomfortable by silence, even if you are giving them a lot of signals that it's not bad silence.
Right.
The most extreme version I can think of is, being on, I don't know, like a date with someone you've been on several dates with, and sitting there with them and holding their hand or something, and like looking at them like just between kind of conversation topics where there are so many signals there that like this is just, it's fine. Like it's just a comfortable pause between conversations.
Right.
And what most people do when this happens is it makes them feel uncomfortable, and they will, in like knee jerk, they'll just start saying something.
Right. Yeah, to them, the only kind of silence is awkward silence.
Right. And so I think to some people, the only type of, like, if things get serious, they kind of do the same thing, but instead of making noise to break silence, they make humor, like they make jokes to break seriousness.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that kind of getting back to TTRPGs in particular, I think it's especially a common problem with new players that kind of feel like too cheesy about taking it seriously, because it's an elf and a dwarf and a goblin working together to, they're like, to them that idea is so like inherently silly that
it's interesting to see where this comes up, because as far as I can tell, D&D has never been more popular.
Right.
And so people will, adults, people that you bump into at work are interested in playing. And someone can be both, they can simultaneously be really interested in playing and have totally nerded out consuming D&D content and reading the rule book and things like that. And then they can show up to the table and be profoundly uncomfortable and self-conscious and and do exactly what you're describing, where they have to make jokes out of it because doing it seriously is just too much.
Right. Yeah. And there's a literary or I guess like narrative concept called bathos, which I think probably a lot of people are familiar with at this point, which is basically undercutting a moment of tension with a joke. And it's one of the bigger criticisms of like a lot of the Marvel movies that have come out over the last decade, where they seem unwilling to like let a moment be serious. Like they constantly remind you like, hey, but this is a comic book movie. Like, and they seem unwilling, or it's an uncharitable interpretation is that they're afraid of like taking anything seriously because then people will make fun of them for it or something like that. So they make fun of themselves. And then it's like, aha, you can't make fun of me, I'm already doing it. Again, that's I'm not saying that's what's happening, but it is an interpretation of it. And I think that there's a similar feeling for people at a TTRPG table as well, to the point that we've been discussing, where it's like, hey, I want everyone to know that, hey, isn't this crazy that, I'm a dwarf who's doing it? It's like, no, it's not that crazy. Like we can pretend that this is real. That's okay. Or not pretend that it's real, but we can take it seriously and tell a serious story doing this if we want.
Well, and I'll admit that I'm a little particularly sensitive about this topic because I used to be a clown. And it was crystal clear to me at some point in my 20s that part of the reason why I was being a clown was because I wasn't brave enough to be earnest about things.
Yeah, right.
And so I mean, of course, part of it is people laugh and you get all kinds of positive reinforcement if you're genuinely funny when you're a clown.
Right.
But and so that's you want more of that. But a big part of it was I was cracking a lot of jokes because I don't know. It's like some mixture of cynicism and cowardice that prevents you from, I guess, to a degree, like wearing your heart on your sleeve and
being
like
genuine.
saying, I care about this. Yeah, I'm genuine. And so I think that might be something that I definitely find that it's the mark of a more mature player that they're able to do serious stuff from time to time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I've gone through something similar. I've sort of deliberately over the last couple years tried to make fewer jokes. Because I was definitely same boat. A clown, like never serious, couldn't get a straight word out of me most of the time. And I realized that that's kind of not the way I want. That's not who I want to be, and it's not the way I want people to perceive me. And it's one of the reasons why I kind of backed out of Table Talk, is because it was getting to the point in my perception where, it's too jokey, and almost exclusively, and so that's why I wanted to carve out a separate space for Revelations, where we have more serious discussions about the topic that we ostensibly are here for on the podcast. Which is not to say that Table Talk is bad. It just wasn't for me anymore.
No, I think
that's my perception.
That's a good division, though. And I guess that brings up another topic, which is, or maybe it's not its own topic, but like I said at the beginning, I know that I'm going to say a lot of critical or constraining things about comedy, and I wanted to make it clear that I'm not anti-comedy. It's probably obvious to anyone who listens to this that we joke around a lot when we record this stuff.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But we do it in a particular way, or there are, I guess, boundaries and guardrails and stuff on that I think keep it a little more balanced. For example, and now we're getting to some of the stuff I put in there, like a lot of the comedy that we're doing is in character. And so taking it back to my one player, the guy who's really focused on making jokes, and that is where all of the mental effort is going.
Yeah.
It's some of that is in character, but a lot of it's him as a player telling a joke to other players. It's coming up with the perfect pun.
Yeah. It's very meta and takes you out of the experience as opposed to
right.
Enhancing
It doesn't
the experience.
deepen the experience; it yanks you out of it.
Right. Yeah.
And I think there's a huge difference between something like that and, like the characters in the party coming up with an inside joke in character or something.
Yeah.
Which can be equally, if not more funny, but deepens the experience in the story and it's not commentary on it.
Yeah, well, and we mentioned this in the Groove finale, the dinner episode of Golden River Underground, Session 9. I think that's a great example of, right, again, deeply comedic, very, very funny. I'm laughing just thinking about it. But the humor came out of the way we were actually having our characters behave in this situation and react to everything, and then your counter reaction and our continuation of the whole event. With particular emphasis on the way Jack was playing Tim Bars. Yeah, but it was all it was all about the situation and continuing to build on certain comedic aspects and doing a very yes and approach to it. It made it, again, just extremely funny, but yet we weren't constantly backing out of the conversation. And coming out of it, we were just diving deeper into it. And at the end, it ended up being a really, really funny thing. And to your earlier point, yeah, I love having funny moments at the table. It's great. It's part of the reason we do the podcast, is because we think that what we do is funny and entertaining, and we want to share that. But yeah, if it had been a more serious situation, then I think that we could adapt to that. Like, we can yes and serious too, and this is just another one of those events where we saw an opportunity for comedy, and it didn't seem like there were any downsides to it, so we went for it.
Yeah, well, and a related thing that I put down was, I talked about how real people use comedy in serious situations, like dealing with tragedy and things like that. I think another thing that goes along with that is you can use comedy in character to illustrate where your character is emotionally.
Yes. Yeah, like a strained joke, maybe, or
a fatalistic kind of thing, or
you can convey their lack of understanding or empathy too. Like if they are making just like a normal joke after something is going wrong, then if you're deploying that tactically, you can be demonstrating that your character does not have an appreciation for the gravity of the situation, which can be very valuable, dramatically speaking.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, I think, an interesting concept, the idea that maybe the point of the joke shouldn't always be to make the other players laugh.
Right. Yeah, it can be part of the story or part of your character.
Yes. Let's see. I'm trying to think of... We're kind of dancing around all this stuff. 'Cause, of course, this is all woven together.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I generally... The problems that I see come up are when people show up with a clown character.
Yes.
And we've talked before. Like I've always been fascinated with horror and mystery games and stuff like that. And I learned a series of hard lessons with respect to how you get a session or a game tonally where you want it. Mm-hmm. And, early days I thought, okay, what I'll do is I'll tell people, hey, this is what I'm shooting for. I'm shooting for something that's kind of serious and it's in the vein of, these movies and books. So, you have an idea of what to shoot for. Mm-hmm. And thinking, okay, that's it's clear, it's broad enough that everyone should be able to come up with something that suits them.
I've given them everything they need to meet the intent. Yeah.
And then... but invariably, someone will say cool, yeah, I came up with a guy. His name is he looks like Jar Jar Binks, but his name is Dick McFartbutt. Right?
And I know he looks like Jar Jar Binks, but he actually speaks like Boss Nass, so it's a little more serious.
Right. And you're like, well, what am I missing here? Right. Yeah, and that happened to me enough times that I realized, okay, it's not about that. It really is about who you invite.
Right.
And then you need to... So I guess what I'm saying there is some people are just going to play funny characters, and you just have to accept that. Mm-hmm. And so, if you want to do a serious game, they're not invited, and that's the end of it. Mm-hmm. Once you do that, though, you need to contextually give your players a lot of hints about what is and is not appropriate.
Yeah.
And so, and that may change over the course of a scenario. It's very normal in Delta Green scenarios, like 1 or 2 shots, for the players to initially be pretty light and funny and stuff like that. And then they get sucked into this grisly case and it gets a lot more bleak.
Right. Yeah.
Which I think is true to life and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But you have to describe that stuff in such a way that it would feel very inappropriate for them to make a joke.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we talked before during one of the revelations about, like, you know, one way you can do that, especially as a GM, is like with handouts of some kind that are like, you know, grisly, or having a description ready of something that, like, oh my God, that sounds really serious.
Or other things like, I mean, you have control of so many different things that affect the way people feel. Yeah, if you're playing in person, you control maybe the lighting in the room, you control the music, you control, like when they get this handout and what it looks like. But I think the big one, probably the biggest one, is your eye contact and expression and delivery when you are talking about something.
Right, some of your nonverbals, you know, and
right.
Obviously doing that in person makes it a little easier as well.
And something else that I've been experimenting with sprinkling in, like, people have very strong opinions on telling people how their characters feel or think. Mm-hmm. But what I will do is I'll tell people, like, hey, what this reminds you of, or something like that. You know, so it's kind of halfway there.
Right, yeah. And you get
so
to still have that control as the player of, like, how I react to that, but you're giving some context that helps to formulate it.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically, I'll give you the kind of instinctual response, but you give me the action.
Yeah.
And so I'll describe something, and I'll tell them this. Yeah, you know this. You can't. When you see this, you can't help but think of that. And you know, you look at. I can describe visceral reactions on the parts of, like, NPCs, and if I'm talking about this very seriously, and I'm looking at them. And they can see that it's serious, it's very unlikely that they're going to say, oh yeah, why I like fart on the corpse.
Yes. Yeah.
That doesn't usually happen. They go, oh, okay, well, I brought my field kit with me, you know, I put my gloves on. Like, they'll get into it if you set it up right.
Yeah, and while you were discussing that, I think there's an interesting thing that you can do that will make players, like, take things more seriously. And that is give one player information that only they know, but make it public in some way that you have given them information that only they have. So, for example, let's say we're playing Delta Green, and you're the handler, and I'm one of the players, and Jack is the other player. Like, if you... During the session, if something happens to, you know, my character, and I do a sand roll and I go past my breaking point or something, if you tell Jack, like, hey, all right, Jack, go in the other lobby and I'll pull you back in, you know, when it's time. Like, he's gonna start, like, speculating, and so he's gonna suddenly be playing with a little bit of renewed interest. And then me, as the person getting the information of, like, you know, whatever has changed about my character that you don't want Jack to know. Right now, it's like I've got a little secret, and I want to play into that. You can do it at a in-person table if, like, you just pass a note, like, very publicly to one of your players, you know, and at the top it says, like, hey, don't tell anyone, but, like, your character, you know, just heard in their head a voice say X. Yeah. You know, and something like that can bring people, you know, it creates a lot of curiosity. And it makes the player who got the information feel like, oh, the DM just handed me something that I gotta, you know, I've got, like, a new special role at the table. I really need to fulfill that. And then everyone else is, like, you know, looking around, oh my gosh, what's going on? And that can tend to, I think, make people a little more serious. That's just a little thing you can do.
Well, I think there's a broader point to be made there, which is that drawing people in and making your scenario interesting and captivating,
yes,
is the way to go here. That's obviously difficult.
Very, yeah.
That's why you want to have, why you want to get comfortable improvising. It's why you want to know who the NPCs are and how you want to set them up and be able to describe these scenes well. But it's easy to make jokes, and it's easy to make jokes when you're distracted. And so if you have a player who's getting bored because I don't know, because of a million different things. Maybe you're not doing a good job explaining the scenario. Maybe it's been 15 minutes since his turn because, other people are taking too long, or it's a really crunchy system or something like that. And so he's long since checked out and been scrolling on his phone, and now it's his turn. I mean, it's the rare player who's both inattentive and very serious and like dramatically on point.
Yeah, big intersection between the disengaged and the quippy.
Right, jokes are easy. That's like shallow end stuff. Mm-hmm. And if you as a GM are also in the shallow end, giving like either a superficial or otherwise annoying scenario, then it's going to be tough to find people who want to do serious stuff. So I mean, taking it back to what you were saying though, coming up with ways to really capture people's interest, and I think what you described, that's a trick or a tool, and it's a good one, but you need more than one.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
But whatever it is, I mean, it's very much like you have to always be courting your players' attention. That is never something you are able to take your foot off the gas on.
Yeah. No, and that's something that, I mean, one good example of that was, I think it was the last episode of Curse of Strahd that we did, where my character, Light of Dawn, kept touching all those, like, big crystals or whatever they were, like pillars. I don't remember what they were, but there was something that there were, like, these trickster gods or something that would do this fell bargain with anyone who touched it. And I kept just... I think like I did it on accident once or something like that, and then something about that changed my character in a way that made me want to do it more. And so Jack and Nerf, their characters are kind of like helplessly watching my guy just get increasingly more like deviant from his true self as a result of this. And you kept kicking them out of the lobby, and then pulling them back in after you had told me what about my character had changed. And after like the fourth time, they were getting very desperate. And it was like a pretty serious moment. Not that there's nothing funny about it, but no one will ever hear this but me. But I got to listen as I was editing to what they were talking about in the other room as this was happening, and they were like in freak out mode. They were taking it very seriously.
Yeah, and of course it's a dungeon master's dream for the players waiting in the outside room to still be talking about what's going on.
Yeah, they were like, we're gonna have to kill him. Like how are we gonna kill him? What's gonna go? That's so funny.
But I mean, I think that's great evidence of the point we're making here. And going along with that though, and I've talked about this a lot with my Monday night group that I DM for in DCC, the players have to feel like they understand how the world works from a rules of the game standpoint, a physics standpoint. Yeah. And that they actually have agency in order for them to take it seriously. And if you can get them to that point, if you can sketch out a problem that they're in and take a step back, and they pretty much understand enough about what's going on that, with answers to clarifying questions, they can argue amongst themselves to figure out what they're going to try to do and what's likely to be more or less successful, those kinds of things. That kind of understanding and trust between the players and the DM at least opens the door to serious and dramatic play, because their decisions matter. And they implicitly understand that.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, that amount of agency makes it feel like it's worthwhile to take it seriously.
Yes.
Which doesn't mean everyone will, but you're creating conditions that make it feasible.
Right, yeah. Necessary but not sufficient. Yeah. And I think going back to the gallows humor stuff, it's great if a player is going to have their character have gallows humor. Because... the character feels like they're in a hopeless situation. Yeah. It's not great if your player is using gallows humor.
Right, because they are helpless.
because they feel helpless and like
Right.
nothing they do matters.
It's like our
not
Adventures
good.
League sessions, right? Where we know that nothing we do really matters at all. So it's just all one big joke. Yeah.
Right. And so that's it's nuanced and it's huge.
Yeah. No, and that's a great point. And in comedy's defense, because as we've said a couple times, this does have the tendency maybe to make it sound like we are against comedy, and we're not. I think that the one of the things that makes things like TTRPG so engaging is that you've got a lot of potential for really high highs and really low lows. Like, a lot of really awesome, funny stuff can happen, and then a lot of really tragic, terrible stuff can happen too. And like, the bigger the gap you can have between those things without making it seem like whiplash, like, that's a crazy night that you're creating together. And so like, totally eschewing comedy is in many ways just as bad as completely eschewing seriousness.
Yeah.
And so but yeah, being able to engage with both of those styles as a group can really enhance the overall story that you're telling. And trying to fight either of those things too hard can also conversely make it a lot worse.
Yes.
Like, oh, we've got the straight-laced guy who doesn't let us joke about anything because he thinks that jokes didn't exist in medieval times or something. And then there's the person who, it doesn't matter how many awful things happen, he's always going to be singing songs that relate to the situation. Like, oh my god.
I will confess to being kind of defensive about this, though, because let's talk about prevalence for a minute.
Yeah.
Pretty much all games, like the vast majority of games, are comedic.
Yes. Yeah.
This is not like some niche, rare thing that your table's kind of the funny D&D table, but the rest of them are pretty buttoned up. That's not true.
Right.
They're all like that, and so if you like D&D, you're playing a lot of D&D, and you think like, man, it would be really cool to have one that's not like a slapstick comedy.
Mm-hmm.
If you're coming at it like that, like hey, I love this, I do this all the time, but wouldn't it be cool if we didn't do that for once? And you try to set that up, like, that's when the dude Steve, who always plays Dick McFartbutt, it's totally fine for him to do that at every other game, but this is like this is your serious one.
Mm-hmm.
This is where you're like, oh man, I really wish we could do something that's like more like Lord of the Rings this time.
Yeah.
We're really gonna take it seriously. And he goes, yeah, okay. Like, that's what makes this offensive. And kind of back to the cooking analogy, it's like, I don't know. I mean, it's like garlic or something, where like, yeah. I like garlic. I don't want a ton of it. And there are some
you add
foods,
too much and it just, now it only tastes like garlic.
Right. But the other thing is, like, I like garlic and I like it on a lot of different types of food. But there's some stuff that I just don't want it on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd also, when I say like, please don't put that on my ice cream, I don't want to then be asked, oh, what, you don't like garlic? And like, no.
Yeah. Right. This is a context where garlic is inappropriate.
Right. Except in this analogy, I've put garlic on every other thing I've ever eaten.
Right.
Like, I just want it not on this one thing.
Uh-huh. Oh, so you hate garlic, huh? Yeah.
Right. So I do think, though, that there are probably a lot of people out there thinking, like, most of these D&D games, it's everybody's like J.R.R. Tolkien or something at their table, and it's all like very straight-laced and studious and stuff like that. And we joke around. That's our thing. Is like we're the comedy table.
Right.
That's not true.
It's literally every table. Yeah.
Right. If you show up to a new table as the funny guy, you are not introducing some like unique element into it that they haven't seen before.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. You might be introducing something, but not comedy. Yeah. No, right. I think that's a great point. And again, anyone who listens to our podcast, like, will find that every episode is, whether you find it funny, is a matter of personal taste, but we are not shying away from comedy most of the time.
Well, and I went back and re-listened to the first session of Golden River Underground like last week, and was shocked by how much I was laughing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I mean, we make a lot of jokes. It's also, though, it's very there's a lot of joking, but serious things happen, and they're reacted to seriously.
Yes, yeah.
Which is, I think, a really great sweet spot, because again, that's like how real life works.
Right, yeah. Yeah, you adapt to the situation and, respond appropriately. And again, I think that's what I was talking about earlier. You got the high highs, you got the low lows. And by low doesn't mean bad, right? Low is just, it's a different mood.
I would call it swings then.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it.
But yeah, I completely agree. I will say my kind of white whale in the TTRPG space is that I'm trying to remember the name of the author. Steven Erikson. I don't know. The guy who writes the Malazan books.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is true or not, but I want to say I read on a dust jacket somewhere that a lot of the content for the books came out of some TTRPG campaign that he and his friends were playing.
Right, yeah.
And it's, this big, grand, sweeping fantasy thing. And, of course, characters make jokes within it, but it all told, it's, it's a serious, detail-oriented fantasy story, and all I could think was like, man, that sounds so fucking cool.
Yeah.
I bet there's no Dick McFart butt in that campaign.
Right. Yeah, or else, this world can't exist with that character in it.
Right. And something like that, probably not on that scale, but running or playing in a game like that where like people came up and they wanted to tell a story and it wasn't explicitly a comedy, is really attractive, and frankly hard to find.
Yeah, and so I think one thing I would offer as advice to people, I mentioned this in the finale of Gru, where I said that over the past couple years, I have sort of grown to really like playing polite characters, who are like very much trying not to be murder hobos and things like that, and kind of deliberately shifting away from certain tendencies and finding that I actually enjoy that much more. I would recommend to people who, and this is probably going to describe a lot of people who tend to play funnier characters, try to play a character that like you take seriously and that takes the world seriously, and just try it on. And you may find that like it's a very, very enjoyable way to play and can create a very different experience. And again, not that means that there can be no jokes, but if you kind of commit to really engaging and being a little more involved and serious about it, you may find that that's not for you and it doesn't fit at your table, in which case don't do it.
But give it a try.
And
I'll take that a step further. Try playing a character that someone else writes for you, the way that, in a way that isn't totally twisted from the way that they wrote it.
Right, yeah, try to take seriously their character. Yeah.
Right. Or try like a pre-gen character, which are included in a lot of games. I was very pleasantly surprised when, this was years ago, but a friend of ours was running a Delta Green campaign, and I was like, my schedule had just changed, and so I was available to play in the game for a little while. And I had written up a character, but then he had said, hey, actually, I had a different idea. I have an NPC that has taken on kind of a larger role with the party. Why don't we just transition that and make it a player character? But, this is a character that's already fairly fleshed out, has motivations and connections and stuff like that. And I thought, I've never done that before. That sounds interesting. And it was a very different character than one I had ever come up with.
Yes.
And I found that it was really interesting, probably more interesting than, if I had gone through. I, of course, don't even remember the character I came up with that I would have played. I totally remember the character that he had me play, and it was, just different, and I'm glad I did it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that is one really good way to do that. Another way to do it is, and this is something that I've messed up on a lot in the past, is focusing a lot on creating a character backstory, but then not really focusing a lot on how is this character different than any other character that I played. Like in the moment-to-moment way that they interact with the world, what's different about them. If you kind of deliberately, again, either have someone else write the character for you and, actually live with that character, or you deliberately make some choices of, hey, this is how this character is going to be different, i.e. they, are really, really, Law and Order focused or something, or they're really oriented towards this one particular goal, or, or they're they've got a weakness for this, or something like that, where you very deliberately make something that is different from everything else you've done, and then focus on that to try to differentiate that character. Because I think if you don't do that, you'll do what me and Jack are both very guilty of, which is kind of just playing the same character all the time.
Yeah.
And not that those characters are horrible and, unworthy of play, but they're not terribly special or memorable. Like, name all the differences between Simon Redding and Light of Dawn. Good luck. Right. So
yeah.
And similar, like Jack with his characters, Tim Bars and Eisen, same character, right? There's nothing different about him.
Speaking of all this, though, there are a couple of things to think about. One is some systems, and I think D&D does this very well, include things you put on your character sheet that kind of remind you of your character's motivations or their flaws or things like that. So,
right.
I don't remember what they're called in D&D, but you pick these little statements.
Ideals, bonds, and flaws.
Yes, yeah, that's it.
And then character traits.
You pick a handful of these things, and they're each one sentence long, and they just describe how your character thinks about things or how they're likely to behave in certain situations. I find those to be very helpful. You don't need to stick to the ones that they have, but having something like that on your sheet is good. And then from a mechanical standpoint, I'm probably going to get this slightly wrong because I don't remember where it came from. But there's this concept of playing to lift, which we have talked about before. And the idea is you have these ideals and flaws and bonds and things like that. And they're not all great. Like some of them are not going to, if you act that way, it's not going to move the party forward. It may cause
it's not to your benefit that this thing is on your character sheet.
But it's part of having a three-dimensional character.
Yes.
And playing to lift is the idea that the dungeon master, or in some instantiations, maybe the other players have a way to do this. Basically, the dungeon master is on the lookout for players that are really leaning into playing their character, like doing things that are good role-playing choices, even if they're not necessarily mechanically good choices.
Right. True to the character, even if they're suboptimal plays.
Right, and rewarding them. Maybe you give them an inspiration when you see them do something like that. It engenders some very good behavior in terms of, like, acting.
Right.
And I think it sends a really good message to the players that, you as a DM are really, like, you really are genuinely interested in telling a good story. And it makes it much, like, we need to be cognizant that, on the one hand, we're saying, like, oh, make interesting character choices, and characters are flawed, just like real people and stuff like that. And then whenever they do something suboptimal, you punish them.
Right.
It doesn't have to be that way. And so, of course, there's the, like, verbal and nonverbal indications, not mechanically, that oh, that's really cool, that's a great idea, and stuff like that. But, throw them a bone. It costs you nothing to give them an inspiration.
Right.
And now, I also think this is good because it's one of the few times that people who really put a lot of effort into role-playing well get a measurable reward for that.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that the players who are more shy or just a little more withdrawn and don't go as hard on the role playing and really focus their attention on like taking good notes or strategizing when you get into combat and stuff like that. Frankly, those people already get a lot of, I think, areas to shine in terms of like actual point scoring.
Mm-hmm.
But the players that enrich the story in more obvious ways, we don't always throw them a bone.
Right, yeah. Yeah, well, I think there's something that's a lot less, like, safe about it. So, again, if I'm just the guy who's really good at, like, TTRPG tactics, if something goes wrong, for me, it's usually, like, bad luck. It's bad rolls, and so no one can really hold me accountable for that. But yeah, if I'm the roleplay guy, if I'm, like, if I'm the Riz Maxer, right, for the party, if I'm the guy out front or I'm the guy who's interacting with NPCs, if things go wrong, a lot of time it's because I just messed up. Like, I personally made a mistake, which, more charismatic players are probably more than eager to, make mistakes anyway. But it can be a little more like, negative in terms of outcome in a lot of ways that you don't really have anything to fall back on. Like, well, I rolled a 1. It's like, no, like, you just lied a bunch, or you just, angered somebody that you shouldn't have, or whatever.
Right. But yeah, I like this as a concrete investment in an important part of the game.
Yeah.
And I have seen it go well.
Sure.
But it does mean players need to think about, and I think this is more important than backstory. Like, people are really focused on backstories. I think, how you think, however you want to capture that.
Right,
is more immediately useful. And certainly that's the kind of thing I would track for an NPC, right? I don't have elaborate backstories for every NPC. What I do have are like characteristics.
Yes. Yeah, and that's, if you look at like the Dungeon Master's Guide, that's exactly what it says to do. Like, yeah, they should have a backstory, I guess, if they're important, but it's, the player's interaction with them is based on their demeanor and behavior and immediately obvious characteristics, like what they sound like, how they talk to you, what their role is. Like, are they a shopkeeper? Are they a are they like a warrior? Are they a royalty? Are they a peasant? Whatever. Like, those things matter, and being able to represent someone who's different that way. Like, if all your characters sound the same and they have different backstories, it's gonna take a really long time for your players to understand how they're different.
Yeah.
And that's something that you had talked to me about a long time ago, back when I did my campaign for you and your buddies, because all my characters were exactly the same, and they had these really elaborate backstories, and nobody cared because they hated these characters, and as well they should have. I didn't. Upon reflection, I don't like them very much either.
Sure, and I mean, also, ironically, I ran the next campaign and did the exact same thing.
Right. Well, it's an easy trap
I was
to fall
convinced
into.
that because I had different notes on these characters that they were different.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to do it, right? Yeah.
Right. They weren't.
Typical trap.
But backstories are primarily useful because they allow you to arrive at characteristics.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I'm super guilty of this. You'll have like a level 1 character that's got like a 3-page backstory. It's like, maybe their backstory should be like 2 sentences because they're level 1, so they haven't done anything yet. Right? So instead, focus on like how they see the world and what they think their role within it is. Right? Because if it says anything about slaying a dragon, you're wrong. Your backstory is incorrect, and you need to redo it. It's one of the funniest things about character backstories.
This is one of the things that I love about DCC is you're given an extremely humbling character description at the beginning.
Right, you're a dirt farmer with a stick.
Right, yeah. I mean, you're a potato farmer. You have a cart that's full of dirt. Yeah, that's it. And you have, 4 or 5 of these guys. One of them survives, and your backstory is you're the villager who, whatever fucked up thing happened that brought you into that funnel scenario, and you survived it and got a little bit of gear. Like that's it. That's all you need to know. Right, and you lost your entire village in the process. Right, and so I really like that. Mm-hmm. Because I think it focuses you on what's important. But yeah. Well, it has the potential to create motivation too. We've also gone like way off topic of funniness. I kind of, but I think tying it back, we've talked about like how much of that is the character and how much is the player. Right. Consider like your character does not have to share your exact comedic sensibilities. Yes. You can play a more serious character than you are in real life. You can play a funnier character. And you can play a character that's, why are they funny? Are they funny because they're insecure? Are they funny because they're oblivious? They're like, kind of a roguish, like, is this part of their charm? Mm-hmm. And their thing is that they're able to convince people of stuff. Like, is it like a confidence man, or are they funny because they don't like perceive themselves the same way everyone else does? Right. Yeah. Why is your character the way that they are, or who is your character, and how is comedy a part of that or not a part of that? That's, I guess, kind of where I'm going with this. Is I think if you take a couple of minutes to put that down on a piece of paper before you get started, you will approach it in a much more deliberate and interesting way. Mm-hmm. And right. Yeah. I think come at it with a mindset that's much more conducive to shared tone at the table, where everybody is synchronizing with each other, and it's not a kind of, and even better, back to what you were saying all the way at the beginning, was if that's a part of the conversation that you have as you are all developing these characters jointly, then that is, so effective usually at coming up with a party that's going to gel. Yeah, it sets a much stronger foundation for the ability to take things a little more seriously. Yeah. Or to have a consistent idea of what that's supposed to look like. But I want to make sure we end on like kind of a bleak, depressing note. Oh, please. So let's run this the way it often goes. Put yourself in the mind of a dedicated dungeon master. He's running a game. He's put a lot of time and energy into this. He's describing some scene. He's ratcheting up tension as best he can. And you are at the other end of the table. You have your phone underneath the table so you can't see it, because you want to check to see if that Amazon package you ordered had showed up to your house. Mm-hmm. And you might as well buy a couple more things while you got it out. And you hear your name. You look up. It's your turn, and you're like, you don't really know what's going on, and you make a dick joke. Hey, GM, does that goblin have his pants on or off? That's going to dictate what my next action is. Yeah, just think about it. Think about the destructive power that comedy has. Right. Well, so, and I'm not saying don't make jokes. I'm saying read the room. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do want to add just one more thing for kind of, again, the destructive power. Comedy in that way also has, in addition to deflating tension, it can also steal the spotlight. Yes. A lot of times when like another player or the DM is having a moment where, something is going on, and then you're like, aha, I've got the perfect joke. And then you throw it down. And even if it is the perfect joke, even if it's super duper funny,
it can have the effect of removing the spotlight from whoever it was on and just forcefully redirecting it towards you. So even really good jokes that are otherwise awesome can have some sort of detrimental effects.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So I think that's it. No more jokes.
No more jokes. We're out. That's the last time anyone ever laughed listening to this podcast.
Yeah.